I started thinking about this book. In a way, I started thinking about it years ago, but I wasn't sure I was brave enough to really go there, because there are many pitfalls in writing about your family, and people fictionalize writing about their family, often for very understandable reasons. But because I knew that there was a really important historical story to tell, I thought this has to be a true story. And what started with thinking, okay, my 4 grandparents were part of a generation that were born into the British Raj at a time in the early part of the 20th century when I don't think until probably sometime during the Second World War would they have thought that the British Empire was ending in their lifetimes. And that was partly because all the physical infrastructure they could see. They were growing up at a time when Lutyens's New Delhi was still being built as the grand new capital of British India, taking over from Calcutta. And it wasn't even inaugurated until 1931. And therefore, I was curious to think, okay, so this massive, the South Asian version of the massive 20th century shift from empire to nation state completely shapes not only their lives, but their children's lives. So my parents were born Indian, became Pakistani, and later became British. And of course, has shaped my life and my identity too. So this was my effort to get to grips with the decisions they had made. And I ended up hoping that the portraits of these 4 people and their life and times is an entry point into a period of history that, even amongst the South Asian diaspora and even in South Asia, is not very well understood. In South Asia, that's partly because there are lots of narratives about nationalism and faith and identity that are rolled into it. But even here, I feel if people like me don't tell our stories and don't understand our own history, how do we expect anyone else to understand the influences and the pressures that shaped our elders and therefore shaped us?
And it's interesting, so, a friend of ours, Danny Finkelstein, wrote this book, Hitler, Stalin, Mum and Dad, this personal story that tells you the story of the 20th century. And your family, these 2 sets of grandparents, do the same, tell you the same, the story of India and Pakistan, and to a certain extent the UK. And I just wanted to ask Mishal, just to read a section. There was a section, just as we were upstairs, I said, look, would you read this section? Because there's it'll sound strange perhaps, but I was reading it, and suddenly this passage comes along, and I just burst into tears. And I want Mishal to read it and then talk about all the things that it means.
So I'll set the scene a bit, because this comes quite far into the story. But essentially, Shahid and Taira, who are my maternal grandparents, they came from the area of India, the Gangetic Plain, essentially, from Lucknow and Aligarh. They were very much rooted in that part of North India. They left that part of India behind when they came to Pakistan. And by August 1947, Shahid, who was a serving army officer and had been working for Claude Auchinleck, the last British commander-in-chief of the Indian Army, the pre-independence Indian Army. He had already left to go to Pakistan to take up a new post in the Pakistan Army. But his wife, my grandmother Taira, was up in Simla in the hills getting away from the heat. And she had had a very difficult journey back down to Delhi because places in India started to become extremely unsafe. There were reprisals against Muslims for what was happening to Hindus and Sikhs in Pakistan. So it was difficult for minority communities right across South Asia. So she'd come to Delhi, and she is just about to leave for Pakistan. And there was a young colleague of my grandfather's, Shahid, called Govind Singh, a young Hindu officer, and who was really, really very fond of my grandmother and her then 3 children. And so this is what happened in the last few days. He had already basically saved her life by escorting her from Simla to Delhi. And then this part comes. Departure, this means Tahira's departure from India, was set for the 23rd of September 1947. And in the final days, Tahira had an extraordinary gesture from Govind. He came and presented her with a box, my Uncle Hassan told me. He said it was a gift, something for the children. It was large, about 8 inches long and 3 inches wide, and when she opened it, she found it was filled with jewels. Govind was related to the royal family of Jaipur, and such a treasure had to be part of his inheritance, Tahira thought. The children will grow up, he said. There will be marriages, and you are not rich people. You will need this. She was flawed. Their lives had been intertwined for the past 18 months through the bond of Auchinleck's circle, but the extent of Govind's love and generosity on the brink of their departure was now at a different level. "Gomji, I can't accept this," she said. For a while he persisted, telling her the jewels were his own, not the property of the state of Jaipur. "These are my personal items and I'm giving them to you for the children." She did not take the box, and from the early 1950s, it was no longer possible to keep in touch, even by letter. Such contact between military families was suspect on either side of the border. But when Govind heard of Shahid's death in 1993, he wrote to Tahira in Rawalpindi, and I remember the letter being passed to each one of us to read. We knew how much it meant to her. 40 years had passed, but they had not forgotten each other.
I find it so moving, Mishal, because this idea of these friendships, and by the way, just in the paragraph before that, Auchinleck says to Mishal's grandmother, "I will take you to Rawalpindi. You know, I may be the most senior British general, but I can see the bloodshed in Pakistan, in India, and I've got a duty to the man who worked with me, Shahid, your grandfather." And just the sense that this was a time when people could see politics and states, not ripping countries apart, but relationships and friendships and those bonds, those, as you described them, broken threads. The strength of those threads is overwhelming. I just wonder where you end up, what you end up thinking, not least of the British partition of India.
You see, I really wanted to get away from the narrative that surrounds this period of time, which is essentially the British left and the Muslims, Hindus and Sikhs fell upon each other and massacred each other wherever they could. And if this did happen in some places and in some periods, but there is a much wider story which is about the social fabric through which communities related to each other, and also how they related to the British, because it was a racially hierarchical system and the British were at the top of the tree, even though there was a process after the First World War of Indianization, which both my grandfathers benefited from, where essentially places are opened up in the civil service and in the officer ranks of the army, and there's an understanding that native Indians need to have opportunities to progress. So I think what I was really conscious of was that there was a whole before and after the really seismic events of August 1947. And I knew that my grandparents, I can't say for sure whether they regretted their decision to opt for Pakistan over India, but I know that they lived with tremendous loss, and that was not only separation from siblings. I remember my grandmother Tahira struggles to keep in touch with her beloved younger brother in India, and how, you know, later on in her life, when she can afford it, I remember once, you know, towards the end of her life, she was here in London and she sent him a ticket to come from India to London to meet her. But, you know, these were even your bonds with your own siblings, if you don't have the opportunity to meet, those start to fray as well. So I did want to paint a full picture of the social fabric, and also just how, I mean, imagine in this country, we would call this generation the wartime generation, and certainly my family on both sides, they were forces families. My father's father was a medic through the Second World War, and my mother's father, Shahid, fought in Burma at a really horrendous time, just as the retreat was happening. Some of what he put in his diary of the time was so horrendous, I had to, when I thought, I've got to fact check all of this, could it really have been that, you know, British power is crumbling this fast in the face of the Japanese advance? And it all checked out, the massive scramble and the retreat from Burma. But yeah, I just felt I wanted to paint a broad canvas. And actually that canvas is not only about India. That canvas from the end of the First World War, just like we are influenced by and affected by events today in the Middle East or wherever else in the world, families like mine were watching the end of the First World War, and they were seeing the creation of lines in the sand and new countries being born in Europe and in the Middle East, the end of the Ottoman Empire. And they were drawing lessons from all of this. What should we be demanding? At that time, the demand in India was largely Swaraj, self-rule, not azadi, independence. And so this period of time really develops and culminates in 1947, but it is very affected by the First and the Second World Wars. And I think overall the conclusion I came to is that Britain was always behind overall what the demand in India was. So what really India should have been a self-governing dominion like Canada and Australia, but it wasn't, and that's probably because the Indian political class were Indian. They were not white.
And all the way through the book, there are these sort of extraordinary little moments. One of your grandfather's friends from school ends up marrying Stalin's daughter.
That one I also had to fact check, and it also checked out. At one point he says, a school friend of mine married Svetlana Stalin, and I was like, what? And yeah, whether they were married, legally, I don't know. But yes, this is true, and it's in the book.
But one of the things about it, Mishal, of course, and it's the curiosity, isn't it, of very, very personal stories hitting huge political narratives. But in one sense, you're particularly lucky in that your grandfather, as you say, worked for Auchinleck and also kept a diary, a memoir, which means in that really critical phase, 46, 47, he's in the room as Britain is making a decision about how to decide the fate of India. And it seems to me as though you come to quite a view on the speed at which that process happens and potentially the really historic mistakes that are made.
Yes, and that was, it was hard because in some ways I wanted to keep the story quite narrow and personal. And then I found this book, as it progressed, getting more and more political and deeper into the history. And there were times when I felt that quite overwhelming because this is complex and there are many communities and personalities. But I thought I have to get to grips with all of this in order to understand it. This has to be as historically accurate a book as is possible, while still written from a particular family perspective. But Shahid was the private secretary to Field Marshal Auchinleck, who I think one of the things that really upset my grandfather was that this country had forgotten Claude Auchinleck. And the reason he felt that was partly about India and Pakistan, but also about Auchinleck's service in the Second World War. He was later referred to privately by Churchill as the greatest general that Britain had in the Second World War. And the reason Churchill thought that was because in 1942, as Rommel and his Africa Corps were sweeping right across North Africa, Auchinleck was the first one to stop that advance. It was at the first Battle of El Alamein in the summer of 1942. He and Churchill then clashed over how fast to advance and to properly push Rommel back. And he was replaced, Montgomery came in, and essentially the second battle of El Alamein that autumn is the one everyone remembers, and Montgomery claimed all the credit. So by the time that Shahid and Tara met Auchinleck in 1946, he was, as far as they were concerned, and I think as far as anyone should be concerned, he was a great war hero that Shahid was working for, and Tahira knew him personally. He had had a crisis in his personal life. His wife had left him for another senior officer in Delhi. It was a scandal of the time. And I came to the conclusion that great men really, the ones we think of as great men today, it is often because they have worked hard to establish that image in all of our eyes. They've written their memoirs, they've had their proxies out there telling their story, they have made sure that their version of events is there. And Auchinleck didn't do any of that. He didn't accept a peerage, and so really I think his rightful place among that panoply of great British wartime generals was lost. And when Shahid worked for him, he said to him, Auk, which is what they called him, Auk, can I keep the papers? Can I keep copies of the papers that cross your desk? And he said, yes, you can. And you can write about me if you like, but you can't do it until after I die. Shahid thought, fine, he obviously didn't want his old boss to die, but he also, I think, didn't anticipate he would live until 1981. So Auchinleck was the last of his generation, and when my grandfather published his partition diary in 1986, it wasn't terribly well received here. And I think that's because it was seen as a partial account, the account of a Pakistani. And now, I think, 40 years on, we have much more of a sense of what Shahid said at the time, which was real history only emerges when we take everyone's point of view into account. I don't think Britain was ready for that in the 1980s.